What's said in church spreads to Jack's. The great leftover miracle. The morning humidity in Piney Grove was thick enough to chew, but inside Piney Grove Church, the atmosphere was even tighter. Pastor Cone stood behind the heavy oak pulpit, a sudden cold panic washing over his linen suit. He reached into his breast pocket. Nothing. He checked his hip pocket. Empty. He had left his reading glasses sitting on the kitchen counter next to his coffee mug. For a second, the sanctuary blurred into a sea of pastel Sunday dresses and nodding heads. But Pastor Cone was a professional. He had preached on the miracles of the New Testament for 40 years. Squinting down at the large print Bible, which currently looked like an impressionist painting, he decided to forge ahead from pure memory. He cleared his throat, leaning into the microphone. Turn with me, brethren, to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, a familiar story of the Lord's boundless provision. He built up the momentum, his voice rising with theatrical passion as he painted the picture of the hungry, weary crowd on the hillside. Finally, he reached the climax of the passage. He couldn't read the numbers, but he felt them in his spirit, or so he thought. And the Lord, Pastor Cone boomed, arms outstretched, took 4,000 barley loaves and 6,000 fishes, and he fed the 24 people until they were entirely satisfied, with baskets and baskets left over. A dead, heavy silence fell over the pews. Up in the choir loft, Sister Ruby froze mid-fan. Before Pastor Cone could transition to his three main points, a sharp, gravelly voice cut through the air from the third row. It was Emmett Stevens, the town's retired barber, and a man known for a temperament slicker than wet ice. "Why, heck," Emmett called out, loud enough to rattle the hymnals. "Anybody could do that." Pastor Cone gripped the edges of the pulpit, his face turning a shade of red that matched the carpet. He squinted hard in Emmett's direction. "Could you, Brother Emmett? Could you perform such a feat?" "Certainly, I could," Emmett scoffed, crossing his arms. Pastor Cone, thoroughly rattled, wrapped up the sermon 15 minutes early and omitted the final stanza of the invitational hymn, The Revelation at Jack's. After the benediction, Pastor Cone retreated to the fellowship hall and furiously poured himself a cup of lukewarm punch. He spotted Billy Ray Huggins by the cookie table. "Did you hear Emmett?" the pastor hissed, his hands shaking slightly. The absolute disrespect, to heckle the holy word from the third row, declaring he could match the wonders of the Gospels. Billy Ray looked down at his napkin, completely avoiding eye contact. "Well, now, Pastor, Emmett's a cantankerous old mule, that's a fact. But to be entirely fair to the man, you did get the arithmetic a bit twisted today." Pastor Cone blinked. "What do you mean?" "You told the congregation that Jesus used 4,000 loaves and 6,000 fish to feed 24 people," Billy Ray whispered. "Pastor, that ain't a miracle. That's just a remarkably aggressive seafood buffet. A man could eat 200 fish by himself at that rate." The color drained from Pastor Cone's face as the reality of his missing glasses set in. He swallowed his pride, but a dark, righteous resolve settled into his chest. "Well," the pastor muttered, straightening his tie, "next Sunday I shall not forget my spectacles, and I am going to show that character exactly who is running this ledger." The leftover lesson. The following Sunday, Pastor Cone marched onto the altar with the confidence of a Roman general. His reading glasses were secured to his neck by a thick, braided black cord. They practically gleamed in the sanctuary light. He didn't wait long. Right in the middle of his opening remarks, he steered the ship straight back into the stormy waters of Matthew chapter 14. He looked directly at the third row, where Emmett Stevens sat, looking entirely unrepentant. "Now, let us re-examine the true mathematics of grace," Pastor Cone announced, adjusting his glasses with a dramatic flourish of his index finger. He looked down at the clear, crisp text of the scripture. "The gospel tells us that the Lord took 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes." The pastor enunciated every syllable, his voice echoing off the cinder block walls. "And with that meager offering, he fed the multitude of 24,000 people." He paused, letting the staggering weight of the corrected numbers hang over the congregation. Then, with a triumphant smile, he leaned over the pulpit, pointed a finger directly at his tormentor, and boomed, "Could you do that, sir?" The sanctuary held its breath, every head turned toward the third row. Emmett didn't even flinch. He leaned back in his pew, chewed on a peppermint toothpick, and nodded with absolute certainty. "Yes, I could," Emmett called back. Pastor Cone's jaw dropped. His victory was evaporating in real time. "And just how, Brother Emmett, would you manage to feed 24,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish?" Emmett smiled, a slow, wicked glint in his eye. "Easy, Pastor. I'd use the loaves and the fishes left over from last Sunday." The bad taste of a number. The dust on Highway 11 was baked dry by 3 straight summers of short rain, and nobody knew the weight of that dust better than Silas Vance. Silas was a man of few words, hard hands, and one permanent shadow, an oversized blue-tick hound mix named Barnaby. Wherever Silas's boots went, Barnaby's heavy paws followed. They were a package deal at Jack's Diner at the co-op, and, on a particularly tense Tuesday morning, inside the cool marble lobby of the Piney Grove Citizens Bank, Silas sat stiffly in a leather chair across from the bank president, Mr. Thaddeus Vance, no relation, as Thaddeus frequently reminded people. Silas laid his weathered hands on his knees. Barnaby sat right beside him, his chin resting heavily on the corner of Thaddeus's mahogany desk, his soulful brown eyes watching the banker's fountain pen move across the ledger. Thaddeus cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. He looked at the crop reports, then at the outstanding equipment notes, and finally sighed the sigh of a man about to protect a balance sheet. "Silas, I've looked at the numbers from every angle," Thaddeus said, his voice flat and clinical. "With the blight on the soybeans and the price of diesel what it is, the risk is just too high. The board can't approve the bridge loan. I'm gonna have to turn you down." Silas didn't blink. He just swallowed hard and nodded once, the quiet dignity of a proud farmer accepting a heavy blow. Barnaby, however, had a different reaction. Without a bark or a growl of warning, the big hound calmly stood, trotted around the massive mahogany desk, sank his teeth into the meat of Thaddeus's left calf, and then walked back to Silas's side. "Youch!" Thaddeus screamed, lunging upward and scattering loan applications like confetti. "Your animal! He bit me!" Silas, stunned, grabbed Barnaby by the collar. "Come on, boy," he muttered, his face turning the color of a ripe tomato as he hurried the dog toward the exit. The lobby was bustling. In his haste to get the hound out the door, Silas practically collided with Old Man Miller, who was standing by the deposit table. Barnaby, still riding a wave of protective adrenaline, lunged sideways and took a quick, sharp snap at Mr. Miller's trousers, catching him right on the ankle. "Lord, have mercy! The beast is rabid!" Miller hollered, hopping on one foot. Silas didn't stop to argue. He hauled Barnaby out into the blinding Alabama sunshine, tossed him into the bed of his truck, and drove back to the farm in absolute silence, waiting for the dust to settle. In a small town like Piney Grove, news travels faster than a grass fire. By lunchtime at Jack's, the incident was being referred to as the Great Banking Massacre. But Thaddeus Vance was a businessman, and he knew Silas was an honest man who had had a terrible day. He let 3 weeks pass, long enough for his leg to heal and for the gossip at the diner to turn back to football. One Friday morning, Thaddeus spotted Silas sitting alone in a booth at Jack's, an untouched plate of biscuits and gravy in front of him. The banker walked over, limping only slightly, and slid into the vinyl seat across from the farmer. Silas looked up, his eyes apologetic. "Morning, Thaddeus," Silas said quietly. "I'm truly sorry about about the whole business. I've kept him chained up since." Thaddeus waved a hand, pouring a splash of cream into his coffee. "Let's let bygones be bygones, Silas. The doctor gave me a tetanus shot, and Miller's pants were already torn anyway. But I've got to ask you something. It's been bothering me for 21 days. Silas tilted his head. "What's that?" "I understand why that dog bit me," Thaddeus said, leaning forward with a wry, curious smile. "I mean, I broke your heart and told you no after you worked yourself to the bone. The dog was defending his master. I get that, but what I don't understand for the life of me is why he bit poor old Miller on the way out the door. Miller didn't do a thing to you." Silas looked out the window at the dusty parking lot, where Barnaby was currently sleeping soundly in the shade of the truck bed. A slow, dry smile finally crept onto the old farmer's face. "Well, Thaddeus, it's like this," Silas said, turning back to the banker. "After he bit a fellow as cold-hearted and sour as you, he just had to find some way to get the bad taste out of his mouth. The blacksmith, the bracelet, and the burden. Alton Ray Huggins always said you could tell the weight of a man's love by what he was willing to carry for it. He told this story one rainy Tuesday afternoon at the shop, while grease-cleaning a clutch assembly, swearing it happened 3 counties over back before the highways were paved. The short smith of Piney Grove. Young Jack wasn't built like your average blacksmith. Most smiths were wide as a barn door with shoulders that could double as railroad ties. Jack, however, stood barely over 5 feet in his thickest-soled work boots. But what he lacked in vertical reach, he made up for in handsome features and a quick wit. He had dark, curly hair, eyes that could charm a bird off a wire, and a smile that made the local girls look twice, until they realized they'd have to look down, Because of his stature, Jack had a terrible time finding a wife. The local fillies wanted a man who could reach the top shelf of the pantry without a step stool. Undeterred, Jack set up his forge in a sleepy little crossroads town. Right across the dusty main road sat a grand, weathered old house. It had a magnificent porch that wrapped three-quarters of the way around the building, complete with a slowly swaying glider swing and a row of high-backed wicker chairs. One crisp spring morning, Jack was wiping the sweat from his brow when he looked across the road. Sitting in the porch swing was a young woman so beautiful she could have caused a multi-buggy pileup at the intersection. Her name was Clara, and she happened to look up at the same moment. Now, Clara wasn't one for waiting around. Seeing the handsome new smith staring over, she smiled, patted her hair, and immediately crossed the dusty street. She stepped into the cool, dark shade of the forge, holding out a delicate silver heirloom bracelet with a snapped link. "Mr. Blacksmith," she said, her voice sweeter than sweet tea at a July revival. "I seem to have broken my favorite piece of jewelry. Do you reckon a big, strong smith like you could fix something so small?" The spark in the anvil. Jack took that bracelet like it was made of spun glass. He knew well that a simple silver solder job took about 4 minutes, but Jack calculated that every minute spent working was another minute he got to talk to Clara. He filed, he heated, he tapped, and he polished. He took so long repairing that bracelet that the sun moved 3 inches across the sky. But neither of them minded. They talked about everything under the sun, and by the time the silver was gleaming again, they were both profoundly, deeply in love. As Jack handed the bracelet back, Clara leaned in close, her eyes sparkling in the amber glow of the forge fire. The moment was perfect. The air was thick with romance. Jack knew it was time to seal the deal with a kiss. There was only one problem. Clara was wearing 3-inch Sunday heels, and Jack was, well, Jack. If he leaned in, he would plant a kiss right in the middle of her collarbone. Jack didn't panic. He glanced to his left, grabbed the edges of his 80-pound cast-iron anvil, let out a mighty blacksmith's grunt, and hoisted himself right up onto the flat face of the anvil. Standing atop his trusty anvil, he was exactly eye to eye with the love of his life. He leaned forward and gave her a kiss that made the sparks fly right out of the chimney. The long green walk. "Jack," Clara sighed, blushing redder than a hot coal. "The shop is quiet today. Why don't you close up for the afternoon? I've got a picnic basket packed with fried chicken and biscuits, and it's too fine a day to spend indoors." Jack jumped down from the anvil, practically floating. "That sounds like heaven," he said. He locked the heavy wooden doors of the forge, and together they set out into the countryside. It was a picture-perfect afternoon. As they made their way across the rolling hills and deep valleys, the birds sang in four-part harmony, and a gentle breeze rustled through the pines. Never in all their days had they seen the grass look so green, or the southern sky look so vividly blue. But as they walked, Jack began to lag behind just a little. Every time they crossed the crest of a hill, Jack would wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead, look at Clara, and ask, "Clara, darlin', can I have another one of them beautiful kisses?" Clara, enjoying the chase and thinking it wise to keep a man eager, would smile mischievously, toss her hair, and say, "Not now, Jack. Not just now. Let's enjoy the scenery." Jack would nod, draw a heavy breath, and keep walking. By the time they had crossed a dozen or so hills, Jack's knees were shaking. His breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. His face was the color of a ripe tomato, and his handsome smile had turned into a grimace of pure agony. He stopped dead in his tracks at the bottom of a steep valley. He looked up at Clara, his arms trembling violently. "Clara," Jack wheezed, his voice cracking, "let me ask you something straight. Do you mean to tell me that the kissing is completely over with?" Clara turned around, hands on her hips, giving him a playful but firm nod. "Yes, Jack, I think that's quite enough kissing for one day." Jack let out a sigh that sounded like a tire deflating. "Well, in that case," Jack groaned, opening his arms, "I'm gonna put down this 80-pound anvil I've been carrying under my arm this whole time so I'd have something to stand on." The heavy iron struck the valley dirt with a mighty thud, and Jack collapsed right next to it, deciding that a piece of fried chicken was a perfectly acceptable substitute for romance for the rest of the afternoon. Jack Tales, the molecular regenerator of Peachtree Street. If you happen to be sitting down at Jack's on a Friday afternoon when the traffic on the bypass is backed up clear to the interstate, the conversation will invariably turn to the bewildering complexity of the modern city. Just yesterday, Dan the man was recounting a disastrous attempt to navigate a multi-level parking deck in downtown Birmingham, claiming the ramps were engineered by a mathematician who hated automobiles. "The city just changes the properties of matter, Dan. Larry said, casually shaking a packet of sugar into his tea. You put a perfectly sensible country dollar into a city parking meter and it vanishes before you can even click the door locked. That was all it took for Jim Henry to set his hot sauce bottle down, lean back on his stool, and break his quiet spell with the legendary chronicle of Older Man Clisby, his boy Junior, and their first encounter with the mechanical sorcery of a metropolitan hotel lobby, the migration from the Hollow. Now, old man Clisby, Jim Henry began, his voice dropping into that rhythmic front porch cadence, was a fellow who had spent 72 years deep in the hollow. He knew how to doctor a sick mule, he could read the weather by the underside of a poplar leaf, and he could predict a frost down to the very morning. But he had never, in his entire life, crossed the county line or set foot inside a building taller than 2 stories. But as luck would have it, an old timber lease settlement required Clisby and his 19-year-old boy, Junior, to travel clean into Atlanta to sign some official ledgers at a high-dollar legal firm. They arrived in the city, flustered, dusty, and completely turned around. To catch their breath before the meeting, they wandered into the lobby of a magnificent gold-leafed hotel on Peachtree Street. The floor was made of polished marble, so slick you could ice skate on it. The chandeliers looked like frozen explosions, and the ceiling reached all the way up to the heavens. The sliding steel sorcery, old Clisby and Junior stood over by a giant potted fern, Jim continued, chuckling as he traced a circle on the counter with his finger. They were trying their best to look like they belonged there, which meant they were standing perfectly stiff and sweating through their Sunday shirts. Right across the marble floor, embedded into the wall, Clisby spotted a pair of massive gleaming silver doors. To a man who had only ever operated a wooden screen door with a screen door spring, these things were pure science fiction. Every few minutes a little bell would ring, ding, and the silver walls would slide open entirely on their own, revealing a brightly lit, velvet-lined little room. Clisby narrowed his eyes. He commenced tracking the ledger of that machine, and the more he watched, the more his agricultural physics began to strip their gears. The atmospheric observations. The machine started performing miracles right before his eyes, Jim Henry laughed, pausing to let the fry cook stop his spatula to listen. Clisby watched three distinct transformations. The multiplication of the trousers. Two high-dollar city businessmen dressed in heavy woolen winter suits, ties, and starched collars stepped inside the silver room. The doors slid shut. Ding! The doors opened 3 seconds later, and three young fellas stepped out onto the marble, wearing white tennis shorts, sneakers, and polo shirts. The vanishing act. A fellow loaded down like a pack mule with three massive leather suitcases stepped into the box. The doors closed. Ding! The doors slid open again, and the carriage was empty. The man, the leather, and the baggage had vanished clean out of the county directory. The ultimate regeneration. This was the one that broke the older man's governor, a frail, heavily bent, deeply wrinkled old matriarch, looked to be about 95 years old and leaning heavily on a hickory cane, slowly shuffled into the silver room. The doors glided shut. Clisby held his breath. The gears in his head were spinning so fast you could nearly smell the smoke. The execution of the order. A few quiet moments passed. Jim Henry smiled, looking around the big corner booth where the regulars were leaning in close. The little bell rang again. Ding! The silver doors parted, and out stepped a magnificent, head-turning, gorgeous young lady, clad in a fine linen dress, her hair perfectly coiffed, walking with the grace of a thoroughbred filly. Old man Clisby's adrenaline hit the red line. He couldn't contain his excitement for another second. He grabbed his boy Junior by the shoulder, nearly tearing his sleeve off, pointed a wild, trembling finger across the polished marble floor, and hollered clear across the quiet lobby, "Boy, don't you stand there looking foolish. Run out to the truck and get your mama." The post-game analysis. The counter at Jack's erupted right on schedule. Butch Hampton let out a gravelly bark of a laugh that nearly upset his napkin dispenser, and Dan the man slapped his knee in pure, unadulterated admiration for Clisby's quick thinking. "I declare, Jim," Larry chuckled, wiping his glasses, "you can't blame the old man for trying to upgrade the home inventory while the machine was running hot. It just goes right back to Fred Craddock's grand theology about the things that don't fit together," Pastor Cone said, smiling as he raised his coffee mug toward the counter. "A 95-year-old country porch swing and a high-speed molecular city elevator do not belong in the same manual. But if you're a man from the ridge who sees a way to bypass 40 years of mileage with one pull of a silver door, you learn real fast to manage your logistics before the electricity shuts off." Jack Tales, The Ecumenical Ultimatum. If you happen to be down at Jack's on a crisp Tuesday morning when the breakfast crowd is thinning out, you'll occasionally find the conversation turning to the tricky business of rules, regulations, and personal discipline. Just yesterday, Dan the man was eyeing a towering plate of loaded hash browns, loudly debating whether his doctor's strict new dietary mandate allowed an extra side of crispy bacon. A man has got to live a little, Dan, Butch Hampton chuckled from two stools down. Sometimes you've just got to let yourself go. That was all it took for Pastor Cone to look up from his black coffee, a quiet spark of pure amusement in his eyes. He set his mug down, cleared his throat, and shared a classic chronicle from a regional ministerial alliance meeting held over in the next county, a yarn about two longtime clerical friends, a plate of country ham, and the absolute perfection of a defensive counterpunch. The clerical counterpart. Now, true friendship across denominational lines is a beautiful thing, Pastor Cone began, his voice taking on that rich, rhythmic pulpit cadence that instantly commands the room. But when you get two seasoned veterans of the cloth together, the brotherly ribbing can get sharper than a two-edged sword. During our annual Interfaith Fellowship luncheon in Dublin, we had two regular attendees who always sat together. One was Father Thomas, a beloved, joyful Catholic priest with a booming laugh and a deep fondness for Southern cooking. The other was Rabbi Goldstein, a brilliant, quick-witted man who had served his synagogue for 30 years and possessed a demeanor as steady as a granite block. Despite their completely different ecclesiastical ledgers, they shared a deep mutual respect, a love for old books, and a relentless desire to catch each other off guard. The smoked meat temptation. Well, Pastor Cone continued, leaning his elbows against the laminate counter, the catering committee that afternoon had laid out a magnificent premium spread. Right in the center of the buffet line was a massive platter of hickory-smoked, honey-glazed country ham, sliced thin and throwing off an aroma that could tempt a saint. Father Thomas piled his plate high with the pork, stepped over to their usual table, and sat down across from Rabbi Goldstein, who was quietly enjoying a plate of smoked brisket and kosher dill pickles. Father Thomas couldn't help himself. He looked at his friend, pointed his fork at the steaming heap of ham, and began to badger the rabbi playfully. "Come on now, old friend," the priest teased, flashing a mischievous grin. "We've been working in the same valley for decades, just between us. When are you finally going to let yourself go, break the old dietary code, and enjoy a magnificent piece of country ham?" The definitive timeline? The table went quiet. Pastor Cone smiled, pausing a beat to let the regulars at Jack's lean in for the closing ledger. The Methodist minister next to them stopped chewing his roll, and the Baptist preacher held his breath, waiting to see how the rabbi was going to navigate the trap. Rabbi Goldstein didn't blink. He didn't get defensive, and he didn't quote Leviticus. He just calmly set his pickle down, wiped his fingers on his paper napkin, and looked Father Thomas dead in the eye. With a face as solemn as a Sunday morning call to worship, and a voice that carried clear across the banquet hall, the rabbi fired straight back. "Father, I promise you I will eat that piece of ham the very moment I hear the music playing at your wedding." The counter at Jack's erupted into an absolute chorus of gravelly barks and clinking coffee mugs. Butch Hampton let out a roar of a laugh that set the glass pie carousel vibrating, and Dan the man completely forgot about his diet, slapping the counter in pure, unadulterated admiration for the maneuver. "I declare, preacher," Larry chuckled, shaking his head as he wiped a stray tear from his eye. "That's what you call using the opponent's own playbook against him. He drew a line in the sand that neither one of them could cross without a direct dispensation from the top. The calculated rejection. If you hang around the research department down at Jack's long enough on a stormy evening when the wind is rattling the aluminum awning, you'll eventually hear the regulars discuss the incredible, terrifying architecture of the human mind. According to the fellas at the corner booth, a man left alone with his own thoughts on a dark country road can build a whole skyscraper of trouble out of a molehill before he even takes 10 paces. Just yesterday, Dan the man was talking about how he spent 3 hours worrying his property tax bill was going to double, only to find out the county owed him a $12 refund. That was all it took for Robert to set his coffee cup down with a definitive click, adjust his cap, and share the definitive chronicle of an anxious traveler, a flat tire, and the hazards of a private conversation. The blowout at the Hollow. Now, there is a particular stretch of the old county bypass down by the river hollow that is entirely devoid of human comfort, Robert began, his voice dropping into that comfortable front porch cadence. It's pitch black, the pines crowd the asphalt, and if your vehicle decides to give up the ghost down there, you are officially isolated from the Census Bureau. A few weeks back, a high-strung young fellow from the city, a real corporate-minded nephew of Old Man Miller, was driving through our neck of the woods late at night. He was humming along, thinking about his spreadsheets when bang, flop, flop, flop. He pulled over into the gravel shoulder, killed the engine, and stepped out into the damp night air. He walked around to the passenger side, and sure enough, his rear tire was flatter than a Sunday morning pancake. He popped the trunk, pulled up the carpet partition, and his adrenaline took its first major jump. There was no mechanical jack to be found. The previous owner had left nothing but an empty rusted bracket, the distant sanctuary. The boy stood there under the stars, completely to his chagrin. Robert chuckled, shaking his head. His cell phone didn't have a single bar of reception down in that hollow. He looked down the dark, winding road, and about a mile up the ridge spotted a lone, distant farmhouse with a yellow porch light gleaming through the oaks. It was his absolute only recourse. He buttoned up his coat and started walking. Now, the first 100 yards were quiet, but by the time he hit the half-mile mark, the silence of the woods started to work on his gears. His mind began to manufacture hypotheses. He took a deep breath and muttered to himself, "Now hold on a minute. What if I walk all the way up this mountain in the dark, and it turns out nobody is even home?" He kept walking, his shoes crunching on the gravel, and the private conversation in his head began to pick up speed. Robert continued, leaning forward against the laminate counter. At the same time, Jim Henry stopped sugar stretching his coffee to listen. A quarter-mile later, a second thought hit him like a cold breeze. All right, let's say they are home. They're country folks. They've got tractors. But what if their equipment is modern and they don't possess a standard automotive bumper jack that fits my specific European sedan? His heart rate was climbing now. His footsteps got faster. By the time he reached the bottom of the farmer's gravel driveway, his imagination had completely stripped its gears. He looked up at that porch light and asked himself the ultimate question: what if they're home, and what if they have the exact jack I need, but they're mean-spirited, suspicious characters who refuse to let a stranger borrow their tools at midnight? What if the old man looks out the window, decides he doesn't like my haircut, and tells me to go sleep in the ditch? By the time the boy actually marched up the porch steps, Robert laughed, a brilliant grin cutting through his wrinkles. His adrenaline was pumping like a high-pressure fire hose. He hadn't even met a human being yet, but in his mind, he had already been insulted, rejected, and cast out into the wilderness by the entire agricultural community. He was absolutely furious. His face was red, his fists clenched, and he trembled with pure, unadulterated indignation. He didn't knock politely. He took his fist and pounded on the wooden screen door so hard the glass pane rattled in its frame. An old, gentle-faced farmer in his nightshirt opened the inside door, blinking sleepily through his spectacles, holding a flashlight. Before the old man could even clear his throat to say, "Good evening, neighbor," the city fellow pointed a wild finger straight at his nose and hollered at the top of his lungs, "You know what, mister? You can take your stupid jack and keep it." And with that, the boy spun on his heel, stormed back down the steps, and marched straight back into the dark hollow, leaving the farmer standing on the porch wondering if the county had commenced an unannounced psychological census. The counter at Jack's erupted right on schedule. Butch Hampton let out a gravelly laugh that vibrated the glass pie carousel, and Larry nearly spilled his sweet tea, shaking his head in pure admiration at the mental gymnastics. "I declare, Robert," Jim Henry chuckled, wiping his eyes with a paper napkin, "that's a man who defeated himself before the battle even commenced. He managed to have an entire domestic dispute with a man he'd never introduced himself to." Pastor Cone smiled, raising his ceramic mug toward the corner booth. "A state of perfect neighborly country hospitality and a mind full of self-engineered panic do not fit in the same territory handbook. But if you're going to walk a dark road in Piney Grove, you'd better leave your calculations in the glove box, or you'll end up fighting a phantom before you ever reach the light." The law of the 60-minute hour? If you happen to slide into the research department down at Jack's on a crisp, frost-bitten October morning, the conversation will eventually turn to the rising cost of modern maintenance. Just yesterday, Dan the man was fit to be tied, waving a receipt from a plumbing outfit over in Odenville that had charged him an astronomical fee to replace a 3-cent rubber washer in his kitchen sink. "They charge you by some imaginary corporate ledger before they even unpack their wrench," Dan hollered, rattling the hot sauce bottles. That was all it took for Jim Henry to clear his throat, adjust his cap, and break the table's silence with the legendary chronicle of old Miss Frances, a stubborn basement furnace, and the absolute, literal enforcement of a service contract. Now Miss Frances was 70 years old, Jim Henry began, his voice dropping into that smooth front porch rhythm that always signals a premium narrative. But if you judged her capacity by her birth certificate, you'd find yourself on the losing side of an exchange. She was a tiny thing, but she possessed the disposition of a circular saw, and a mind that could calculate compound interest down to the half penny. She lived by herself in that old rock house out on the ridge, and she didn't believe in wasting daylight, words, or currency. Late one autumn afternoon, right when the first real Canadian cold front was howling through the Alabama pines, her old floor furnace refused to click on. The house was getting drafty, so she reluctantly picked up the rotary phone and called the big heating and air conglomerate over by the interstate. Within an hour, a young service technician arrived in a shiny white van. He stepped onto her porch wearing a crisp, spotless blue uniform with his name embroidered over the pocket, carrying a high-tech digital diagnostic clipboard and a toolbox that looked like it had never seen a speck of real red mud. The 5-minute miracle. The young fellow marched down into the basement with an air of immense corporate authority, Jim continued, chuckling as he stirred his coffee. Miss Frances stood right at the top of the stairs, crossing her arms, tracking the ledger. The technician wasn't down there long enough to catch his breath. He located the trouble instantly, a loose copper wire on the thermocouple matrix. He gave it one quick twist with a pair of needle-nose pliers, blew a handful of dust off the pilot light, and whoosh, the gloriously warm air started pumping right up through the floor grates. Time elapsed from the moment he opened his toolbox to the moment the heat kicked on. Exactly 5 minutes. The boy smiled proudly, marched back up the stairs, and presented Miss Frances with an official, multi-copy itemized invoice. He tapped the bottom line with his ballpoint pen and said, "That'll be $70 for the labor, ma'am." The corporate rationale. Miss Frances looked at that piece of paper, Jim Henry laughed, and her eyebrows went up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. $70 for labor? She exclaimed, her voice snapping like a dry twig. Son, you weren't even down in my cellar long enough to get the dust off your shoes. That's $14 a minute. The young technician put on his finest, slick, trained customer service smile and deployed the corporate defense mechanism. Well, ma'am, the boy explained smoothly, leaning against his clipboard, I understand your perspective, but our company has a strict, non-negotiable policy. We have a 1-hour minimum charge for any residential service call. The second I put my boots on your property, that 60-minute clock starts running. It's the law of the company handbook. The change in production. Well, Jim Henry smiled, looking around the counter as Larry and Robert leaned in to listen. Miss Frances didn't stomp her feet. She didn't call the manager. She just looked at that young man real quiet like, reached into her apron pocket, and pulled out a crisp $50 bill and a 20. She laid him flat in his palm. All right, son, Frances said, her voice turning sweet as sorghum. I'm a woman of commerce, and I respect a contract. If your company dictates that I have bought 60 minutes of your physical labor and you've only delivered 5, then by my calculations I have 55 minutes of your time left on my ledger. The technician's smile went completely flat. Ma'am? Miss Frances marched straight out to the back porch, reached into the tool shed, and came back holding a heavy, long-handled Sears and Roebuck bamboo rake and a roll of heavy-duty plastic garbage bags. She thrust them right into the young man's hands. The execution of the contract. For the next 55 minutes, Jim Robinson roared, taking over the finish with pure delight. That slick city technician spent his afternoon out in the yard. The wind was blowing, the oak and hickory leaves were falling thick as snow, and he was out there in his shiny uniform, raking, sweeping, and bagging foliage under the strict, unblinking supervision of Miss Frances, who sat on her porch swing, drinking a hot cup of sassafras tea. Every time his dispatch radio would squawk in his truck about another service call down the highway, Frances would tap her wristwatch and point toward a stray pile of leaves near the well house. He didn't drop that rake until the second hand on his watch hit the 60-minute mark on the dot. The counter at Jack's erupted into an absolute chorus of gravelly barks and clinking coffee mugs. Dan the man completely forgot about his plumbing bill, slapping the laminate in pure admiration for the senior maneuver. I declare, Larry chuckled, wiping his eyes with a napkin. That boy learned more about contract law on that ridge than he did in his entire corporate training seminar. Pastor Cone smiled, raising his mug toward the corner booth. A pristine, high-dollar mechanical service technician and a bamboo leaf rake do not belong in the same paragraph. But if you're living out in Trustville, you learn real quick that if you charge a grandmother for an hour, you'd better be prepared to give her 60 minutes of honest-to-God devotion. The economics of the water hazard. If you hang around the research department down at Jack's on a Saturday morning when the local golf course is packed out, you'll eventually hear the fellas get around to discussing the true value of an investment. In Piney Grove, a good trade isn't measured by a Wall Street ledger, it's measured by practical utility. Just yesterday, Jim Henry was bragging about a high-dollar digital fish finder he bought that can map out the bottom of the river, which caused Dan the man to finish his scrambled eggs, wave his fork in a high-velocity circle to flag down the room, and share a classic yarn about two elderly golfers, a terrible slice, and the ultimate shifting of priorities that comes with a lot of mileage on the odometer. The search at the 8th hole. Now everyone knows the 8th hole over at the County Country Club is pure psychological warfare, Dan the man began, his hand gestures wide enough to clear out the sugar dispensers. It's a short par 3, but it features a massive murky water hazard right in front of the green that has swallowed up more premium golf balls than the local pro shop can count. On a warm Tuesday morning, two old-timers named Amos and Elbert were puttering their way through 18 holes. They'd been playing partners for 45 years, which meant they didn't even need to use words to argue anymore. They just used sighs and sideways looks. Amos stepped up to the tee box, took a short, stiff practice swing, and struck his ball. It started beautifully, but halfway through its flight, it developed a wicked, late-stage slice. Plop. It landed right in the dead center of the pond, sending a ripple across the duckweed. Being men who grew up during the Depression, they weren't about to leave a $3 Titleist behind. They drove their golf cart down to the water's edge, grabbed a couple of iron wedges, and commenced to poking around in the mud and the cattails to see if they could fish the sunken ball out of the drink. The amphibian proposition. They were wading through the weeds, Dan continued, leaning over the counter, when Amos spotted something blinking up at him from a wet lily pad. He reached down into the moss, thinking it was a lost head cover, but found himself looking straight into the eyes of a massive, bull-legged green frog. Before Amos could drop it, the frog blinked, cleared its throat, and spoke up in a clear, high-dollar princess voice. "Sir," the female amphibian said, her voice echoing across the water hazard, "I am actually under a terrible ancient spell. If you will give me a tender kiss, I will instantly transform back into a stunningly beautiful 25-year-old royal princess. I will move into your house, cook your meals, clean your garage, and accompany you to every single tournament for the rest of your days." Elbert was standing 10 feet away in the mud, and he heard the entire proposition. His jaw dropped clear down to his collarbone, and he stood frozen, waiting to see his buddy witness a genuine fairy tale miracle right there on the back nine, the pocket investment. "Well," Dan the man laughed, sweeping his arms out wide to illustrate the climax. Amos didn't blink. He didn't pucker up. He didn't even hesitate. He just calmly looked at the frog, gave a slow nod of appreciation, and carefully slipped the talking amphibian straight into the front pocket of his canvas golf bag, zipping it shut right up to the top. Elbert went into an absolute state of cardiac shock. He dropped his pitching wedge into the mud, scrambled over the bank, and hollered at his partner. "Amos, have you completely lost your mind? Why in the world didn't you kiss her? You had a premium, gold-plated royal princess handed to you on a silver platter." The senior assessment. Dan the man paused, a brilliant, knowing grin spreading across his wrinkled face as he looked around at the regulars sitting at the counter. The whole room leaned in, waiting for the ledger to close. Amos just picked up his golf club, Dan chuckled, wiped a speck of mud off his denim trousers, and looked his old buddy dead in the eye. With a voice perfectly calm, unbothered, and full of country wisdom, the old golfer replied, "Well, Elbert, I'm going to tell you the truth. At this particular stage of my life, I'd much rather have a talking frog." The counter at Jack's erupted right on schedule. Jim Henry let out a gravelly bark of a laugh that nearly upset his coffee mug, and Butch Hampton slapped his knee so hard the silverware rattled inside the bin. "I declare, Dan," Larry laughed, shaking his head as he wiped his glasses with his napkin. "That's a man who understands his own inventory. A royal princess requires a level of upkeep that an old man's lower back can't handle." Pastor Cone smiled, taking a slow sip from his fresh mug. "A beautiful high-maintenance fairy tale palace romance and an 80-year-old golf game do not belong in the same sporting manual." But if you've got a talking frog in your pocket, you've at least got something to entertain the boys down at the clubhouse without ruining your evening routine.